Good morning, buenos días. Me complace mucho acompañar la facilitación de este workshop y quiero comentarles que el Comité de Expertos para la Administración Pública adoptó 11 principios de gobernanza eficaz para el desarrollo sostenible en su 17º periodo de sesiones en 2018, los cuales fueron respaldados el mismo año por el Consejo Económico y Social. Los principios proporcionan un marco para evaluar las capacidades institucionales y tienen por objeto ayudar a los países interesados a identificar formas de crear instituciones eficaces, responsables e inclusivas para lograr los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Uno de los 11 principios es la elaboración de políticas sólidas para alcanzar los resultados previstos. Las políticas públicas deben ser coherentes entre sí y deben ser construidas sobre bases verdaderas o bien establecidas, en plena consonancia con los hechos, la razón y el buen sentido. Los exámenes nacionales voluntarios de los últimos 5 años muestran algunos de los retos comunes en todo el mundo para la elaboración de políticas sólidas. Estos incluyen las deficiencias en la planificación estratégica a largo plazo, la insuficiente atención a las sinergias políticas y la falta de mecanismos integrados de seguimiento y evaluación. También incluyen una combinación de esfuerzos, comunicación y coordinación insuficientes entre las diferentes organizaciones y una fragmentación de los mandatos y las responsabilidades para la implementación. Los países han desarrollado una serie de estrategias para resolver estos problemas, pero estos fenómenos confirman que la gobernanza eficaz y el logro de los ODS requerirán abordar desafíos de larga data para las instituciones públicas, incluyendo los diversos abordajes que se discutirán esta mañana. Me gustaría comenzar este taller virtual de trabajo dando la palabra al señor Elliot Harris, subsecretario general de las Naciones Unidas y economista jefe, que ayudará a sentar las bases de nuestro trabajo de hoy. Señor Harris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, distinguished participants, resident coordinators, colleagues. On behalf of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this workshop on sound policy making for sustainable development. I wish to thank you, Mona Pisani, the Vice Chair of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration, and our moderator today, for your collaboration with us on this initiative. I also want to thank you in particular for your ongoing efforts to promote the principles of effective governance for sustainable development throughout Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, in the short term, the pandemic has evidently affected the way in which public services are delivered. It has disrupted the regular functioning of state institutions, and it continues to affect key government functions and processes, undermining the effectiveness of government action. We must act decisively and urgently to ensure the resilience of our institutions to COVID-19 and to other shocks. In the longer-term recovery, the Decade of Action, which, as you know, was supported by heads of state at the SDG Summit in September 2019, calls for accelerating sustainable solutions to challenges such as climate change, inequality, and closing the finance gap. It specifically calls for action at the local level, such as embedding necessary transitions into policies, budgets, institutions, and the regulatory frameworks of governments, cities, and local authorities. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning we are discussing the principle of sound policymaking, identified by the Committee of Experts on Public Administration as one of its 11 principles of effective governance. Like all the other principles, sound policymaking is universally applicable, relevant in all government paradigms, regardless of variations in national legal systems. This principle is flexible enough to account for different national realities, capacities, and levels of development. Governments are and should be at the center of efforts to marshal initiatives to mobilize financing, to enhance national implementation, and to strengthen institutions for achieving the Sustainable Development Objectives by the target date, and to leave no one behind. Sound policy making is crucial for the development of national sustainable development strategies. And here, the integrated nature of the SDGs and the process of coherent policy making converge. Both systematically consider the pursuit of multiple policy goals in a coordinated way in an attempt to minimize trade-offs and contradictions and to maximize synergies. Foresight and visioning exercises can be used to inform strategic priorities of national development strategies. And national and sectoral plans should be evidence-based, drawing on the science policy interface. They are made much more effective with monitoring and evaluation which assesses the causes of success and of failures. The principle you are discussing today, that of sound policy making, together with the other 10 principles enumerated by CEPA and endorsed by the ECOSOC in 2018, can thus make a significant contribution to the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. They could also be useful in providing a conceptual framework for the institutional factors of political economy analysis, for example, in connection with a common country analysis. Distinguished participants, several countries are presently working with the UN and other partners to develop integrated national financing frameworks, the INFFs, which aim to facilitate contributions of all sources and types of financing to deliver on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for sustainable development. Adequate institutional capacity to guide and underpin the entire INFF process is crucial for making the Sustainable Development Goals achievable. Guidance recently published by UNDESA sets out a governance framework for the success of an INFF. The strategy notes that will be discussed in this workshop describe the broader landscape of specific practice areas that are relevant to an integrated national financing framework, such as how to overcome silos and how to promote coherent policy making. They also provide important markers pointing in the direction of methods, guidelines, and technical assistance that are available for those who wish to go deeper and to take action. We are very pleased to have the involvement of our empowered, development-focused resident coordinators and the members of UN country teams in this initiative. Resident coordinators play a pivotal role in the country-level strategy and its engagement towards the 2030 Agenda. Inclusive dialogues with national partners are ongoing as the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Frameworks are being rolled out. The Department of Economic and Social Affairs stands ready to support these efforts. Dear colleagues, the COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear that in many areas of the world, progress is insufficient to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Experience shows that policy reforms to strengthen much-needed governance capabilities require concerted efforts and bold structural change. At the same time, many pragmatic improvements in building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, implemented incrementally over a period of years, can yield important long-term results, as CEPA has pointed out. Let us join efforts to strengthen evidence-based policy making and analytical capacity as we move forward on action and delivery for sustainable development. I thank you all for your kind attention, and I wish us all an interesting and successful workshop. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Elliott, for setting the stage for our work today. Considerando que el tiempo disponible en el formato virtual de esta reunión es limitado hoy, nos centraremos en experiencias de los países de la subregión andina de América Latina. Sabemos, estamos conscientes del número de buenas prácticas en esta región y nos complace aprender hoy de las lecciones sobre cómo se han elaborado políticas adecuadas y exitosas en América Latina. Esperamos que la discusión de esta mañana pueda contribuir no solo a una mayor concienciación sobre los temas relativos a la elaboración de políticas sólidas, sino también a la identificación de actividades concretas y orientadas a la acción, así como de iniciativas de desarrollo de capacidades para mejorar la elaboración de políticas efectivas que puedan llevarse a cabo con el apoyo del sistema de las Naciones Unidas y de otras organizaciones. El taller se divide en dos partes. La primera parte será para examinar las perspectivas regionales para la elaboración de políticas efectivas y exitosas. En la segunda parte se debatirán 4 de 8 estrategias específicas para poner en práctica este principio. Los animamos a consultar las notas de orientación sobre todas ellas que están en la página web del evento. Mantendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas después de ambos paneles. Pueden contribuir al debate con un comentario o pregunta a través de la función del chat. Los participantes deberán mantener las cámaras y el audio apagados en todo momento. Le agradecemos muchísimo el interés que ha tenido este evento y les informo que hemos recibido más de 200 preguntas a través de la inscripción y también que tenemos más de 200 inscritos para la actividad. A mí me da muchísimo gusto en este momento empezar con el primer panel, perspectivas de la región, y tengo el honor de presentar al doctor Luis Felipe López Calva, Assistant Secretary General y Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean del UNDP. Mr. López Calva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair Moni Pisani. A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, ASG Harris and colleagues, DCO Director Christian Salazar, and all the national authorities that are represented, think tanks, and colleagues from the UN system. It is really a pleasure to be part of this important event. What I will present is an overview that we in UNDP have been presenting in other contexts related to some of the challenges that we're facing this particular year in terms of recovery after the COVID-19 shock. And I will land into the conversation very much related to the framework of this event in terms of the policy effectiveness and the importance of sound policymaking and evidence-based policymaking as essential principles for a recovery that will take us to an enhanced normality. So let me briefly present a few concrete ideas based on this presentation that I will assume, if I'm not told otherwise, that you can clearly see and you can also hear me. So the idea is precisely how the policy coherence discussed in this framework could help us improve the quality of the recovery under the SDG lens. First, to start, as we all know, reminding us that Latin American and Caribbean region has been particularly hit very strongly by this crisis. We are the region that has been hit the worst because of the pandemic in terms of the economic impact. So that's the first element. And there is a lot of uncertainty if we look at different forecasts for recovery. For different countries, there is a lot of uncertainty. And we want to start this conversation by looking into 5 drivers of uncertainty that will be present throughout the year. And I think it's going to be very important to keep them in mind as we think about policy design for the recovery. The first driver of uncertainty is the access and capacity of countries to deliver universal vaccination. We see here, for example, that high-income countries having around 29% of the population at risk have, however, access to 61% of the full availability of vaccines at this point. And as we can see, the availability of vaccines goes down for countries that have higher needs in terms of population at risk. So there is going to be a serious issue related to equitable access to vaccines that is already represented, also linked to the capacity to deliver vaccination. And we see also the heterogeneity. In the case of LAC, certainly Chile being the most advanced and something that we can also look at as a good practice, but other countries are now starting universal campaigns of vaccination. So that's going to be a driver of uncertainty. The second one is the fiscal space and the financing needed for recovery. So if we look at the COVID response and the spending that will be needed to maintain this response, we have estimated at UNDP that countries will need around 4% of GDP, around $228 billion in extra funding, while during last year in the markets, countries were only able to collect around 53 billion. Of course, the markets are very liquid, but it will be very difficult to think that countries will have access to this full amount. So there will be also an issue related to driver of uncertainty in that respect. Third one is how we're going to recover quickly from the very high level of unemployment created by this crisis. We see here the shock in terms of the fall in employment and the increase in unemployment. We're talking about around 34 million jobs lost for the region, and we need to recover soon. And what are the instruments that we have? The fiscal stimulus has to be is very important, but not as effective as we would think we would like because of the supply side nature of the crisis. We need to focus on medium and small and micro enterprises because they create around 60% of total employment. But the problem is that we see here, financial intermediation and financial depth is relatively lower in our region compared to other regions and with developed countries. So as much as we can inject liquidity, there will be restrictions in terms of how much we can do through the injection of liquidity. So there are structural constraints for that recovery. And finally, two last drivers of uncertainties. First one is the deteriorating trust in institutions that could be exacerbated by the crisis, particularly in the context of an electoral year. So it's very important to maintain the integrity and to support the integrity of electoral processes to rebuild trust and legitimacy in governments. And finally, I would like to talk about the importance to recover the educational systems, to start fully the educational system. We have had more than 140 million children out of schools. It's very important to go back to school quickly in a way that will be also in an equitable way. Estimates by the World Bank talk about a loss in terms of human capital due to the crisis and in terms of earnings because of the destruction of human capital, which is about $1.2 trillion, which is a little bit less than the size of the Mexican economy. So the region has lost, in terms of human capital destruction and earnings, around an economy the size of Mexico. So the opportunity has to do with policy coherence and has to do with sound policy making. The policy arena has to be strengthened to produce better development results that are focused. At the end, coherence, etymologically, leads us to the idea of being together around one objective, right? So we have to be really focused on this strong, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. And we need to make sure that these power balances in the policy arena are compensated through very inclusive processes of governance, so we can actually have an inclusive recovery. So three aspects here. We, as you in UNDP, are relaunching our governance offer based on three elements. The first one is how to improve policies. The second is how to think about potential changes in some rules of the game that have to be revised. And finally, which actors we have to bring into the policy arena. And that has a lot to do with the coordination part in this conversation on policy coherence. So basically these three buckets: first, what can be solved through policies, better policies, what can be solved through rethinking rules of the game, and what would need coalitions of actors to push for changes in a certain direction. Some principles of effective governance we promote at UNDP as fundamental pillars of policy coherence have to do with fiscal policies, law and access to justice, participation in the construction of agreements, capacities, investment in capacity and innovation, transparency and accountability, trust and legitimacy, elimination of violence as a mechanism for negotiation, being our region being one of the most violent regions in the world, and finally, the idea of sustainability and intergenerational equity. We believe that these principles can really support a solid agenda of policy coherence. So we in UNDP are fully convinced that this agenda and these conversations that we're having on sound policy making are fundamental in the recovery and in the long-term success towards the achievement of the SDGs. Thank you very much again for the invitation to be part of this panel.
Muchas gracias, doctor López Calva, por una excelente presentación y un estado de situación de la región y también algunas ideas de buenas políticas. Yo de inmediato voy a dar la palabra al señor Cristian Salazar Bolman. Él es director regional de United Nations Development Coordination Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. Cristian, la palabra es para ti en este momento. Muchísimas gracias. Recuerdo a los expositores que, dado lo corto del tiempo, se limiten a los 7 minutos que están previstos. Muchísimas gracias.
No, muchísimas gracias, Pisay, por tenerme acá. Elliot, Luis Felipe, es un honor, un placer estar, pero también, como se dice, un hard act to follow, porque tanto Elliot como Luis Felipe son realmente de nuestros thought leaders en la región y yo voy a tratar un poco de nuestra perspectiva, agregar algunas reflexiones sobre qué significa la formulación de políticas públicas bajo las condiciones actuales y los extraordinarios esfuerzos que sabemos que los gobiernos de la región están emprendiendo para mitigar los efectos socioeconómicos de la pandemia. Y en general, desde mi perspectiva, buenas políticas públicas tienen 4 características. Primero, ponen las personas en el centro de su atención. Segundo, se desarrollan en forma participativa, es decir, se consultan con las comunidades y grupos sociales afectados. Tercero, tienen un enfoque multisectorial, porque casi ya no existe ningún problema de desarrollo que un solo sector o un ministerio pueda solucionar a solas. Y cuarto, se basan en datos estadísticos desagregados. Voy a enfocar mi breve intervención esta mañana en este último punto, porque como ha descrito Luis Felipe, nuestra región está afectada por la recesión económica más fuerte en tiempos recientes y las proyecciones de pérdida de empleo y de aumento de pobreza son sin precedentes. Esto quiere decir que la pandemia va a afectar y está afectando de manera desproporcionada a las poblaciones más vulnerables de nuestra región. Y esto significa que la protección de las poblaciones vulnerables del impacto socioeconómico del COVID debe ser uno de los objetivos principales de la política pública en nuestra región. Y eso pone sobre la pantalla, de nuevo y con urgencia, un tema de larga data. Yo escucho un poco de sonido de fondo. Ahora sí.
Agradecemos que mantengan los micrófonos apagados porque interfiere con la presentación. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Disculpe. Entonces, yo creo que en esa situación un tema que ya es de larga data está de nuevo en la pantalla y es el tema de la extensión de los servicios básicos sociales universales con calidad hacia toda la población. Y formular políticas públicas de alta calidad para extender los servicios básicos sociales a toda la población requiere esos datos estadísticos desagregados para conocer quién exactamente está, no se alcanza, dónde está, qué características tienen esas personas. Y ese tema es un tema que ya lo hemos visto en el desarrollo de la Agenda 2030 y por eso tiene ese lema de no dejar a nadie atrás, porque ya se ha aprendido de la década anterior de desarrollo, los Millennium Development Goals, de que hay muchos avances que se ven bien en forma general y cuando uno mira a las estadísticas desagregadas, viene que no es tanto así, que incluso pueden haber tendencias que se ven como progresos que al verlo más de cerca están incrementando las desigualdades en cuanto al acceso a estos servicios. Y entonces creo que la desagregación de datos es una de las herramientas centrales actualmente para prevenir que el COVID-19 profundice las desigualdades en nuestra región y nos propulse décadas atrás en la lucha por la igualdad y la justicia social. Y en ese sentido, quiero mencionar que en toda la región, las Naciones Unidas han desarrollado planes de respuesta socioeconómica al COVID. Y muchos de estos planes, primero, tienen análisis de impactos socioeconómicos muy buenos y además incluyen medidas hacia el fortalecimiento de la colección de datos digitales, por ejemplo, para la toma de decisión en los sentidos que yo los he mencionado. Esos planes se basan realmente en muchos años de cooperación técnica entre las oficinas nacionales estadísticas, los ministerios de planificación y las Naciones Unidas en relación a los ODM y los ODS. Por ejemplo, como el colega de Colombia va a hablar, equipo de país de Naciones Unidas ha apoyado por años un programa conjunto con el Departamento Administrativo Nacional de Estadísticas para apoyar el seguimiento a varios indicadores de los ODS, no solo a nivel nacional, sino a nivel local con metas e indicadores muy específicos. En Perú, similar, trabajo con el Instituto Nacional de Estadísticas e Informáticos, no solo para crear plataformas online sobre los ODS, sino también desagregar algunos indicadores, por ejemplo, la reciente encuesta dirigida a la población venezolana que reside en el país, para tener más evidencia cómo abordar las necesidades de esta población, o la visibilización de la situación de los niños, niñas y adolescentes en Perú. Son algunos ejemplos, hay muchísimos más y por tiempo no quiero ahondar. Solo tal vez para mencionar, para finalizar, los esfuerzos recientes de las Naciones Unidas en Trinidad y Tobago, aunque no se cubre, entiendo, en esta reunión, pero ahí se está trabajando mucho el tema de Big Data. Ahora, eso es lo opuesto de la desagregación de datos, es más bien una agregación, una macrovisión, pero creo que en nuestro mundo de buenas políticas públicas, tanto la desagregación como el uso de Big Data va a ser muy importante para la calidad de las políticas públicas. Entonces, termino con eso. He mencionado al comienzo que el uso de información desagregada solo es un componente de las buenas políticas públicas, así que muy interesante escuchar la multiplicidad de aspectos alrededor de este tema. Muchas gracias por su atención y gracias de nuevo por tenerme acá.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristian, por tu intervención y por poner sobre la mesa algunos temas que creo que ahora con la intervención que sigue, que es el señor Daniel Gómez Gaviria, Deputy Director de la Oficina Nacional de Planeación y Desarrollo de Colombia, creo que va a complementar muchísimo y vamos a ir redondeando ya este primer panel. Así que adelante, Daniel, el micrófono es para ti en este momento. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos.
Muchas gracias a todos por la invitación. Un saludo a Luis Felipe y a todos los participantes. Quiero entonces darles una perspectiva un poco desde Colombia de cómo estamos implementando y usando estos principios de buenas políticas públicas para crear políticas, y enfocándome en particular en cómo lo estamos usando para diseñar políticas de ODS 1 y para políticas de reactivación económica con el recientemente aprobado COMPES, que es nuestro instrumento de política pública en Colombia para la reactivación. Entonces, a modo de introducción general, en Colombia creo que tenemos unos instrumentos interesantes para lograr esos objetivos y esos lineamientos de política que hemos escuchado de parte tanto de Luis Felipe como de Cristian, en términos de tener políticas que tengan una visión de largo plazo y que tengan el potencial de trascender periodos de gobierno. Eso yo creo que es muy importante. Dos, son instrumentos que permiten intersectorialidad y coordinación y articulación entre diferentes áreas y sectores del gobierno. En particular, creo que tenemos dos herramientas importantes en Colombia. La primera es el COMPES, ¿cierto? El COMPES es el Consejo Nacional de Política Económica y Social, es nuestra máxima instancia de formulación de política pública. El Departamento Nacional de Planeación ejerce la Secretaría Técnica, y en esa Secretaría Técnica tenemos una metodología para construcción de políticas que básicamente se basa en formular un árbol de problemas, identificar claramente cuáles son los problemas que hay que resolver, luego diseñar unas acciones que responden a la solución de esos problemas en particular. La metodología también exige hacer una revisión de los antecedentes y esto garantiza que haya una cierta continuidad en políticas y que siempre estemos construyendo sobre las experiencias anteriores. Ahí incorporamos entonces lo que aprendemos a partir del monitoreo y evaluación de políticas públicas pasadas, evaluamos también lo que pasa internacionalmente y creo que esta metodología ayuda bastante a racionalizar y a darle estructura a las políticas que estamos aprobando. Adicionalmente, pues el COMPES involucra y es aprobado pues en un consejo de ministros. Básicamente el COMPES es el consejo está conformado por los ministros, el director del Departamento Nacional de Planeación y es presidido por el presidente y es un gran espacio realmente para tener discusiones muy técnicas a nivel ministerial y con esta visión de largo plazo. Las políticas que llevamos al COMPES usualmente son políticas a 5, a 6, a 10 años y eso permite pues cambiar el chip un poquito de estar pensando en las soluciones de muy corto plazo a estar pensando en soluciones estructurales de largo plazo. La segunda herramienta que tenemos en Colombia que creo que está ayudando a capturar los 8 principios de CEPA es el Sistema Nacional de Competitividad e Innovación, que es un sistema de diálogo estructurado público-privado para temas de competitividad. Entonces también tiene un enfoque de largo plazo pensando en productividad, en competitividad y tiene una estructura interesante porque tiene instancias a nivel nacional y subnacional que permiten también coordinación no solo entre sectores sino también entre el nivel nacional y subnacional y esta herramienta ha sido clave en este periodo de pandemia para pensar en la reactivación desde el punto de vista de las regiones. Entonces, dos aplicaciones claves de estos dos sistemas de formulación de política pública y luego tal vez voy a mencionarles algunos puntos nuevos en cada uno de los 8, en algunos de los 8 principios para ilustrar cómo estamos como incorporando nuevas ideas. Pero creo que importante mencionar que en Colombia los ODS, la política de ODS se implementó a través de un documento COMPES, una política COMPES del estilo que mencioné ahorita. Es el COMPES 3918. En ese COMPES se aterrizaron los ODS al contexto colombiano con 161 indicadores para hacerle seguimiento a nivel nacional, con acciones, con un marco de gobernanza, con un comité de alto nivel que hace seguimiento a esta política. Y eso pues es un instrumento importante para lograr tener permanencia y continuidad de políticas a través de los diferentes gobiernos. gobiernos. La segunda aplicación importante es la más reciente y quisiera contarles un poquito de qué se trata. Es la política de reactivación y repotenciación económica, que creo que responde o tratamos de responder en gran medida a la presentación y la introducción que hizo Luis Felipe López. Muchos de los elementos creo que buscamos reflexionar sobre ellos e incorporarlos en el plan de acción de esta política. La política tiene dos ejes, un eje de reactivación de corto plazo, pero enmarcado en el marco de una visión de a 6 años. Busca tener políticas que ayuden a que los hogares, el sector productivo, el gobierno puedan adaptarse más fácil, retornar a una senda de desarrollo pre-COVID y mejorarla con criterios de sostenibilidad y de inclusión. Fueron los dos criterios de largo plazo que incorporamos. Adicionalmente, el plan de acción de política complementa un plan de inversiones ambicioso, también con una visión de mediano largo plazo, para que no sea únicamente un rebote este año, que es natural que vayamos a crecer más que el año pasado, donde tuvimos pues una recesión importante con crecimiento de menos 6.8% del PIB. Entonces queremos que esta reactivación de este año sea realmente una reactivación sostenible. Cosas nuevas que estamos incorporando dentro de nuestra formulación de políticas en línea con los 8 lineamientos. Estamos trabajando mucho más en metodologías de prospectiva para poder pensar hacia adelante en escenarios y tener una metodología y un marco lógico para poder pensar mucho más sistemáticamente en prospectiva. En temas de análisis e impacto regulatorio también estamos pues avanzando mucho en la implementación de metodologías de análisis ex ante, ex post de impacto normativo. Estamos avanzando también en crear capacidades en todo el gobierno y en todas las entidades públicas para hacer este tipo de análisis de impacto. Con la ESAP hemos trabajado y diseñado cursos para certificar en estas metodologías y en estas herramientas, y hemos adelantado pues ya un buen número de análisis de impactos normativos y creado pues también una institucionalidad para hacerlo, ¿cierto? Entonces, finalmente, pues en todo el tema estadístico, creo que estamos avanzando también en el tema de Big Data. Tenemos una política de Big Data desde el 2018. Hemos avanzado también en temas de digitalización, que es una palanca transversal para la reactivación, y en el sistema de monitoreo, evaluación, seguimiento y retroalimentación de políticas desde el DNP, desde en particular pues la dirección de evaluación de políticas públicas. También estamos avanzando no solo en tener los sistemas de seguimiento como Sinergia, también para las políticas en COMPES se hace el seguimiento de acciones vía SISCOMPES, una herramienta pública que también contribuye a la transparencia y a la participación, sino que también estamos pues avanzando con nuevas herramientas como los mapas de brechas de evidencia, para poder tener un mapa de brechas de evidencia, un mapa completo de qué entendemos que ha pasado con diferentes políticas a nivel mundial, como un insumo para su formulación, además de tener pues las evaluaciones de impacto de programas particulares. Entonces, COMPES más Sistema Nacional de Competitividad e Innovación, creo que en Colombia son los dos mecanismos a través de los cuales con Secretaría Técnica del DNP hemos ido incorporando nuevas herramientas, y los 8 lineamientos y los 8 principios que nos presenta el CEPA creo que son buenos ejes de trabajo para seguir profundizando y mejorando y avanzando en la formulación de políticas, en particular con todo el tema de interoperabilidad y uso de datos. Eso va a ser crítico. Ahí estamos avanzando en temas bastante nuevos. Todo el tema de infraestructura de datos quedó contemplado en el COMPES recientemente aprobado, y pues seguiremos, tenemos planes este año que también se los contaré en futuras reuniones para poder seguir implementando nuevos avances, y sin duda todo este conocimiento compartido es de gran ayuda para todos para poder seguir avanzando. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias al director adjunto de la Oficina Nacional de Planeamiento de Colombia, por su intervención. Habían hecho una pregunta en el chat donde podían conseguirse estas orientaciones de políticas públicas de Colombia, pero ya está respondido, documento COMPE 44023 del 11 de febrero del 2021. Me complace en este momento dar la palabra al señor Jan Hartlack. Él es el representante residente, es el coordinador residente y el representante ad interim del Programa Nacional de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo en Venezuela. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madame Pisani, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this workshop. Greetings to everyone.
Mr. Hast, you're muted.
Lo perdimos.
Please unmute your microphone.
Okay. Sorry, you hear me now, I suppose. Thank you, Madam Pisani, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this workshop. Greetings to everyone. Just to be clear, I am interim resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Venezuela, but permanently I am the resident representative of the UNDP in Venezuela. Obviously, it's hard to argue with the 11 principles for effective governance for sustainable development and the need for sound policy making to operationalize these principles. But as we have heard from the previous presenters, most countries in the region still have many challenges to overcome. At the same time, there are opportunities to seize where the United Nations, among others, can provide technical and advisory support and share successful experiences from the region and globally. In this respect, the work of CEPA and the expert groups who are developing the guidance notes is extremely important. But let me say a few words about the relevance of this work for the country I work in, Venezuela, and how it could be operationalized. Venezuela finds itself in a particularly challenging situation in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The prolonged economic contraction since 2013, exacerbated more recently by economic and financial sanctions, and since a year ago also by the pandemic, means the country is very much off track to reach the goals. Institutional capacities have eroded as many qualified people have left their jobs and the country. Diminishing financial space has resulted in years of underinvestment in critical infrastructure and services. And the private sector is struggling to survive, and millions of people require humanitarian assistance. In response, the UN system in Venezuela has significantly increased its capacity in the country to provide critical assistance to the most vulnerable, reaching some 4.2 million people in 2020. At the same time, the government has recently initiated the process of some much needed economic and financial reforms. And an active and constructive dialogue between the government and the private sector, which for many years was considered impossible, is happening and starting to bear some fruit. While these are positive signs, the lack of revenues and access to international financial markets and developing financing severely limits the country's options of turning the situation around. It also limits what we as UN can do to support, given that, for example, the humanitarian response plan is only 20% funded and very little funding for recovery and development is available. And while the private sector must play an important role in the country's recovery, for now it first needs to recover itself. Against this background, we are currently preparing the next UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework for the country. It is expected to focus on integrated solutions to help the country recover and reduce humanitarian needs while restoring pathways towards sustainable development. Rebuilding institutional capacities for sound policy making and implementation is, of course, a critical part of this. But it will require investments that are currently still out of reach for both the government and the UN, and may well be for some time to come. In the meantime, the government must make every effort to enter into dialogue with as broad a range of stakeholders as possible to build a consensus on the way forward in addressing critical needs of the country. This is not going to be easy. While the dialogue with the private sector is a good sign, the political divisions in the country run very deep, and the prospects of an inclusive political settlement are still elusive. Yet work is being done involving all sides to find ways, for example, to help Venezuela access COVAX and procure vaccines, and to expand humanitarian assistance to the country. If effective mechanisms can be found to do this, it could in time help create conditions to also start addressing the more structural needs that are critical for the country to recover lost ground and resume progress towards achieving the SDGs. To conclude, sound policymaking and effective strategies to operationalize these policies are a necessary condition for a sustainable recovery in Venezuela. But without proper access to the means of operationalization, it would be a very difficult task for any country. Therefore, all stakeholders, both inside and outside Venezuela, need to reflect on this in a practical and constructive manner for the sake of 30 million Venezuelans inside and outside the country, and the need to leave no one behind. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to make this statement.
Muchísimas gracias. Con la intervención del señor Hart, concluimos el panel, el primer panel. Tengo un par de preguntas que de las muchas que han formulado, tengo una pregunta específicamente para el señor López Calva. La pregunta es, cuando habla de cambios de las reglas de juego, ¿a qué reglas se refiere? ¿Y en qué sentido se propone su cambio desde la dirección del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo para América Latina y el Caribe?
Muchas gracias. ¿Me escuchan bien? ¿Sí? ¿Se me escucha bien?
Sí, te escuchamos.
Ok. No, es muy importante decir que cuando hablamos de los cambios para la gobernanza efectiva, clasificamos estos cambios en términos de aquellos que tienen que ver con acuerdos relacionados con política pública, segundo, los que tienen que ver con reglas, y tercero, los que tienen que ver con coaliciones. La situación específica es una decisión de cada contexto, y es una decisión en la que nosotros como PNUD podemos traer experiencia, podemos traer conocimiento, apoyo técnico, crear espacios de discusión, pero lo que no corresponde al PNUD decir qué reglas se deben cambiar. Corresponde a cada sociedad, a cada grupo de actores. Dicho eso, los ámbitos a los que nos estamos refiriendo tienen que ver, bueno, un caso, por supuesto, obvio es el caso de Chile, en donde se está llevando a cabo un proceso de reforma constitucional. Obviamente eso es un cambio amplio de reglas, pero nosotros nos estamos refiriendo, por ejemplo, a temas relacionados con reglas fiscales. Si se ponen impuestos, por ejemplo, no solamente a los flujos, como son el consumo y el ingreso, sino también a los acervos, como son la riqueza o la propiedad. Cambios que tienen que ver también con la autonomía, la mayor autonomía de algunos órganos de regulación, cambios que tienen que ver con diseño organizacional o del fortalecimiento de la capacidad, por ejemplo, en sistemas anticorrupción. Es decir, nos estamos refiriendo a ese tipo de cambios, pero yo insistiría de manera muy clara que no corresponde al PNUD decir cuáles reglas deben cambiar, eso corresponde a las discusiones soberanas en cada contexto.
Muchísimas gracias. Bueno, realmente tenemos muchísimas más preguntas, pero el tiempo, como les he mencionado, es bastante corto. Solamente voy a hacer una pregunta más y está dirigida a Cristian. Y la pregunta es, ¿cuáles son los ejemplos de buenas prácticas que debemos hacer y qué debemos hacer para usarlas y reproducirlas a nivel nacional? Cristian, si pudieras respondernos esa pregunta, pues creo que sería muy valorada.
Realmente es muy difícil responder esa pregunta porque creo que en nuestra región, en todos los países, hay mucha abundancia de experiencia, tanto en el tema de los datos desagregados, pero también en el tema de la consulta con grupos, digamos, afectados de la política pública, etcétera. Lo que yo sí creo que quiero remarcar es que en la situación actual en la que vamos, con, digamos, ese impacto muy fuerte en ciertos grupos sociales, pero en grandes poblaciones, unas reacciones naturales de definir proyectos específicos para diferentes grupos vulnerables es algo que tiene que ser parte, digamos, de la respuesta pública, pero yo creo que lo más importante es ese tema de los servicios universales que he dicho y las políticas públicas allá, porque es un tema que lo hemos discutido en el pasado y que, digamos, alcanzar a los 10% de la población que todavía no se alcanza con los servicios públicos que existen es un gran reto, y estos 10% tal vez son más caros y más difíciles de alcanzar que los primeros 60 o 70% de la población. Pero yo creo que si queremos tomar esa crisis como una oportunidad, debe ir por allá, porque la democracia y el tejido social se fortalecen, y la clase media, por decirlo así, cuando hay buenos servicios públicos universales. Entonces, yo creo que la crisis ahora es un chance de enfatizar mucho eso, y esto quiere decir de nuevo, o sea, sí diseñar políticas diferenciadas como para extender estos servicios, pero no caer en el error por parte del Estado de abrir una bolsa para este grupo y otro proyecto para este grupo, como Estado, digo, sino que realmente invertir en estos servicios públicos con las características que tenemos experiencia, ¿no? La consulta de la gente, etcétera, etcétera. No hacerlo solo del escritorio, sino que realmente escuchar organizar esas consultas a nivel de comunidad. Eso sería como la respuesta, porque hay tantos buenos ejemplos que no sería justo marcar uno u otro. En cada país de nuestra región hay esos buenos ejemplos. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristian. Y bueno, voy a hacer una última pregunta para el director de la Dirección Nacional de Planeamiento de Colombia. En el plan de inversiones, ¿en qué sectores se va a invertir y si esa inversión es pública o privada? Y con eso sí cierro las preguntas, porque si no podemos pasar 2 días acá respondiendo a todas las inquietudes. Así que, por favor, su respuesta.
Claro que sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta. En total tenemos 552 proyectos identificados que le pegan a 5 compromisos, los llamamos, por Colombia, con inversiones aproximadas de más de 135 billones para los próximos 6 años. Las fuentes combinan fuentes públicas y privadas. Queremos apalancar en particular el uso de las PPPs, de las APPs, participaciones público-privadas en proyectos. Vamos a jalonar también recursos de regalías, presupuesto general de la nación, y en cada uno de estos ejes hay proyectos en el sector en particular, los más grandes, para responder concretamente a la pregunta, están en el sector transporte con 42%, sector de vivienda 7.2% del total, sector de educación 4%, entonces hay en negocios verdes hay otro grupo, pero entonces principalmente hay unas inversiones importantes en infraestructuras de diferente tipo, incluyendo vías terciarias, que eso va a ser muy importante y bonito, porque no solo va a permitir mejorar competitividad, mejorar productividad, sino también conectar mercados que nunca han estado conectados con los centros de consumo y con los mercados internacionales. Entonces, el proyecto de vías terciarias incluido dentro de este plan de inversiones, que es la inversión pues, más grande que se ha hecho en los últimos años en vías terciarias, va a tener un impacto de convergencia regional, de cierre de brechas, un impacto en equidad importante, a la vez que tiene un impacto en competitividad y productividad.
Muchísimas gracias. Ahora sí, lamento no podamos responder todas las inquietudes. Vamos a coordinar con la Secretaría de CEPA a ver de qué forma podemos responder a todas las preguntas que se están formulando. Y con esto cerramos el primer panel y pasamos entonces al panel de estrategias para operacionalizar políticas públicas. Así que me complace dar la palabra a Patrick Spirin. Patrick es el secretario del Comité de Expertos de la Administración Pública. Y Patrick, the floor is yours. You are mute.
Is this better? Okay, sorry about that. All right, so this is maybe the more technical part of the workshop, or where we get into some of the technical details connected with these strategies. As you have heard many times already, CEPA has developed these 11 principles of effective governance and associated with them a number of strategies, or what we might call practice areas, to operationalize them. Under the principle of sound policymaking, there are 8 strategies, and there are notes prepared on each of these, 4 of which will be presented today by the experts who have helped us produce these notes. The experts are really leading minds in their respective fields, and the notes have also been prepared in consultation with global practice areas. So what you'll see in them, we hope, will represent the best available information, the best available advice from the global networks. The notes themselves are intended for different audiences, or audiences at different levels. For those who don't know about these practice areas, they will have enough information in the notes to understand the fundamentals. For those who are already engaged in these different practices, there may be an opportunity to identify how to adjust elements of the practices to achieve better results. And for those who are more advanced, they'll be able to recognize the fundamentals of these strategies and the success factors. Perhaps tap into more into peer-to-peer learning and research networks. We hear that there are many players. We know that there are many players at the country level, the regional level, the global level, and that there's a proliferation of tools from many institutions within the UN and outside the UN, and this can be very overwhelming for UN country teams and others who are involved in policy making. So one of the purposes of these notes as well is to draw a broad picture of the landscape in each of these strategy areas and see if there can be some clarity on where to move forward within different national and local contexts. The notes you will see online, you can see that they refer to basic elements, the building blocks for their implementation. As I mentioned, peer-to-peer learning and research networks are referenced in these notes as well, and opportunities for engaging with international organizations and seeking technical assistance. So fundamentally, this work is all about operationalizing these principles, and we hope that as we hear from some of the experts going forward in this part, that that the participants will think about how the work that's being presented can lead to action, how it can contribute to the operationalization of sound policy making, and through sound policy making to the achievement of the SDGs. So thank you, Moni. Back to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now I am going to give the floor to Dr. Mans Nielsen, Executive Director, Stockholm Environment Institute on Promotion of Coherent Policymaking. So, Dr. Nielsen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will give a couple of remarks related to the note on coherent policymaking, and I will share a presentation. So, can you just confirm that you see the presentation?
Yes, we see it.
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, I work, my day job is as the director of the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I just want to note we've been established since 2018 also with a research office in Bogota, Colombia, where people are working on expert advice to policymaking and decision making in water, in SDGs, in land and bioeconomy and climate change. But today I will talk about the issue of coherent policymaking and give a couple of appetizers around this topic. So our basic starting point is the 2030 agenda and the indivisible whole. As you know, the SDGs together paint a clear picture of sustainable development, but that they need to be seen together. And the SDGs and the policies we use to achieve them affect each other in positive and negative ways. So if we don't take into account how these effects ripple through the system, progress in one goal can actually slow or undo progress in another. But the flip side of that, if we do take careful consideration, we can use the knock-on effects and the positive feedback loops to exploit the SDGs for each other's benefits. And this is kind of the rationale for promoting coherent policymaking in the 2030 agenda. The challenge, of course, which will not be familiar to most of you, is that public administrations are not organized to deal with issues that cut across traditional sectors, traditional silos. And this leads to fragmentation of decision-making, compartmentalization, and sometimes even competition between different parts of a government, for example. So there's a need to inject some momentum and some methods and approaches to promote coherence so that we can capture the trade-offs and synergies in order to make more robust and more effective policies and implementation strategies. It doesn't happen by itself. It needs to be a conscious choice. What happens by itself is usually the institutionalization of silos and sort of putting a momentum behind counteracting this is necessary. And this is what this strategy note is trying to talk about. I will mention that this note talks primarily about horizontal coherence, which is how you cut across different policy areas in a government. But there's often reference to vertical, international, and institutional coherence as well. You can read a little bit on the slide what this is about. And there are a number of adjacent kind of similar concepts with similar connotations: policy coordination, policy integration, joined up government, whole of government, which was a popular concept in the UK about 20 years ago. And with the OECD have been promoting policy coherence for development and policy coherence for sustainable development in the last couple of years as well. And they have a lot of case studies and guidelines and so on published as well. I'd like to start by mentioning sort of that coherence is really not an end state, but I would say it is you can see it as a scale or a constant aspiration to improve the unification of government decision making. This scale was produced already in 1994 under the banner of policy coordination, and it ranges from fully independent decision making up to the sort of holy grail of unified strategy. And in between there, you have different levels of convergence and coherence between different parts of government. Communication, consultation, agreement, arbitration, joint up priorities, etc. Another way of putting a diagnostic on your level of coherence is to look at different dimensions of policy making. So policy framing, how issues are defined. Are they defined in narrow terms, or are they defined in a holistic approach. The policy goals, similarly the policy instruments, are they addressing a sort of a sectoral approach, or are they sort of taking into consideration relevant subsystems and across different subsystems? I'm not going to go through all detail here. It's just a pointing to this table in the note, which will allow you to do a little assessment of where you are at. So once you have that assessment, you need to start thinking about how do we kickstart this, and how can we move our government or our administration into a more coherent approach. And these are some of the quite common tips and mechanisms that are used today. For example, establishing a high-level interagency committee, importantly that it's hosted by a high-ranking ministry at the center of government. Establishing a coordinated institutional mechanism so that there is a procedure for discussion between the different ministries. Conducting mapping and simulation exercises, arranging multi-stakeholder consultations, ensuring that SDGs are visible and mainstreamed across policies, strategies, but also budgeting. And the use of impact assessments, of course, to figure out how do draft policies seem to affect across different development dimensions and SDGs. And then one can impose sectoral mandates to kind of force the different sector administrations to think broadly and report on their effects across different development dimensions, also beyond those that they are primarily responsible for. And finally, engaging in the UN-driven international cooperation that is available through the economic commissions regionally and through UNDESA and the high-level political forum centrally, which is an annual opportunity to sort of touch base on and share experiences. There is a trade-off involved, like with everything in life. There are barriers to coherence and there are risks with coherence. So it's very important to be aware of these. They can be mitigated, but they need to be sort of acknowledged and dealt with. Usually coherent policymaking might affect the routines and procedures that are in place already. There might be inherent goal conflicts or interest conflicts between two issue areas. There can be a lack of resources. There can be a lack of political will to do it. And a lot of people experienced in the bureaucracies might have come across failed experiments from the past doing better coordination. And there can be a kind of a cynicism around, are we trying this again? And then there is the real issues also, that it can be more time consuming. It means also you might lose some control from a sectoral point of view if you're starting to engage widely, and it can be blurring the lines of accountability and making it more difficult to measure policy effectiveness. But I would like to say that these are things that can be mitigated, and they are small downsides, but it's still worth it very much to pursue better coherence in decision making. And finally, I'll stop here. Just a reminder of like what I think is the MIC, the MIC model of engaging more with coherence. It is, you need to be mapping your policy interaction to understand the system that you're trying to affect. You need to integrate your processes so that different parts of the decision-making apparatus, the government is communicating. And then you need to ensure that the decisions themselves are coherent so that you're not contradicting or counteracting another part of the government when you are acting in your part. And so I'll stop there and be very happy to take some questions and discussions later on. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now I will give the floor to Ms. Kat Tully and Ms. Lynn Hundy. They both are from the School of International Futures on Strategic Planning and Foresight.
Buenos dias, senhora Pisani. Bom dia a todos. É grande prazer de estar aqui. Hi, my name is Kat Tully, and I'm going to actually switch off the translation, because otherwise I'm going to hear two things at the same time. So, what a pleasure it is to be here. And what I'm going to be talking about is things that have already been identified. Mr. Harris talked about the fact that we have bold plans for the future, but we are falling short. Mr. Lopez talked about the disruptions that we're facing. And Niels just now has talked about the importance of coherence. I'm going to be talking to you about how do you plan and be coherent in policy over time when our planning assumptions with traditional strategic planning is that you plan as if tomorrow is going to be like today, but in the world that we're in, and when we're facing a need for a transformed set of plans for a transformed 2030 future, how do you open up imagination and ideas to do the strategic planning process in a different way, strategic foresight? And that is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I would like to start off by underlining that I have been working with CEPA and ECLAC and various ministries of planning across Latin America, and of all the regions in the world, Latin America has got some great early work and expertise in this space. So as Daniel Gaviria said, there is some fantastic innovation, so absolutely build on what's already there. But the world is full of disruptions, not just COVID, but also I saw that Luis Pacheco said, what about climate change? There are also slow-moving drivers of change gradually happening around us that over 10, 20 years have a massive impact. If you care about conflict and you look at the Israel-Palestine issue, the fact that Palestinian women have 6 children each and Israeli women have 1.7, if you put that straight line trajectory out over 20 years, in 20 years' time, the drivers and the scenarios and the situation are very different to what we're doing now. So what I help organizations, countries, sectors do is think about how do you think about alternative futures in a world of uncertainty without just saying we don't know. So that is what strategic foresight is. It's an organized and systemic way to still engage with uncertainty, but in a way that doesn't proliferate options, still enables you to make the same kind of decisions that you need to do in strategic planning around who are you recruiting, what activities are you doing, how much investments, where should you be investing in order to create systemic change. And there are 3 key underlying principles. You need to look at the drivers of change, as we discussed, how they interdepend. For example, with systems thinking, if you care about reducing maternal mortality in 10 years, it's not just about investing in doctors. It's also about thinking about what will change the infrastructure to get people from remote villages to the hospitals, because that's the biggest driver. And then it's also about not just planning for one desired future, but recognizing that there are alternative scenarios. So for example, you may think, synthetic biology, there are huge innovations happening over the next 10, 15 years in the agribusiness and in universities research that means that the process of food production is going to be transformed. But whether it goes for the good or the bad really depends on government intervention around intellectual property And so it's important to have different scenarios to think through how governments can best do that. So strategic foresight helps do various things, building vision, bringing people together, stakeholders, to create an aspirational vision that they want, but also manage the risk that the future will evolve in ways that you can't control very often and that you need to be prepared for. And at the same time, it's all about setting up, as CEPA has done, the kind of institutions for anticipation that enables you to identify early warning signals and plan Bs that you can put into place. So a quick question for you to think about as I continue my presentation for the next 3 or 4 minutes. Just think about how prepared do you think your government is for the future, and write that down in the chat box. So strategic foresight and this approach to strategic planning can be used in many different ways, and the guidance note has got a lot of case studies and examples, and the next few slides I'm going to go through very quickly, not expecting you to read them, but it's to give you a flavor of what's inside that guidance note. It can be used, like in South Africa 30 years ago, as a process for peace and reconciliation between different stakeholder groups around what does the vision for your future community look like. Finland, and after all, the SDG framework is universal, and what I find most interesting in strategic foresight is the cross cooperation between governments from the global south and the global north, how much learning there is. Finland, Rwanda, Colombia, Malaysia, Singapore, for example. But we can learn a lot about Finland, about how to build the institutions for long-term thinking, connecting citizens and politicians and civil service. Mexico City, like Medellin, has fantastically worked with citizens, participatory, to come up with new models and ideas for public service delivery by thinking about a desired future. And of course, you can do these exercises at a sector level, smallholder farmers, the future of the minerals industry. How do you start preparing with your business community and your not-for-profit, the civil society, conversations about your future? So here are some ways of taking this forward. You can apply this immediately on your planning process, the national planning process, or on a particular policy area. Just think before what we have to do in terms of planning perspective, what are the possible alternative scenarios first? And perhaps you can wind tunnel, stress test how resilient your current policies are to those different alternative scenarios. That's a good way of doing it. Or perhaps backcast, go from your future vision of 2030 to 2025, what does that mean? Or 2021, what does that mean? The other point is that it is important not just to build capability, but also connect to senior decision makers and make this relevant. So you're thinking about the future, but it's because you're improving your portfolio or your financial decisions. So connecting into the Treasury, into the Ministry of Finance and Risk, and also academia is very important. Third point is COVID-19 has really brought questions around intergenerational fairness to the fore. This kind of process will ensure that younger voices are taken into account, and it's very important. And thinking about foresight not just as a process, as a journey or a report, but as an ecosystem. So how does policymaking and your institutions and government think about the long term, whether it's parliament, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the civil service? That's also very important. So in the document, you will see some really interesting guidance perhaps on how to build your governance ecosystem to be long term. So a final question to you, if you can put it in the chat box, how prepared do you think your government is for the future? And in terms of next steps, first thing, do connect to the excellent practitioners from Javier Medina in Colombia to the great network around CEPA and the others who are already collecting fantastic information. reach out to the UN team. The country analysis process and UNDAF is a fantastic opportunity to look broad, raise awareness, run 1-hour sessions with senior political leaders about what's going to happen in your country for the next 10, 15 years. And perhaps if you have a key sector like tourism or agriculture, focus in on that with some key external stakeholders. Here are some resources and networks that you can apply for and get more information. And I really invite you to go to this link to get more information and more resources about how you can integrate this into your work. So, muito obrigada, muchas gracias, y have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Obrigada, Kat. Thank you so much for your intervention. Now I give the floor to Ms. Lynn Hundy. Ms. Lynn?
Sorry, we're going to go to Mr. Claudio Radielli.
Excuse me?
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Okay.
Yeah, I see from your smiles that it's my turn. I am the author of the concept note on regulatory impact assessment, which is something that you do typically at the stage of policy formulation of the design of a new law or regulation. The concept note revolves around 4 questions. What is it? What can this tool do for you? How to implement it, and what needs to be done? So I would describe regulatory impact assessment in simple words as 3 things. It's a document. It's a single template that you use to examine and appraise a range of likely impacts of a proposed policy. But it's also, number 2, a process. It's a process of discussion, evidence gathering, and preparing analysis and discussing numbers and the likely impacts across departments and with the stakeholders. And thirdly, it is a communication platform used to engage stakeholders on proposed policy. It's typically a document with depth that is proportional to the level of importance of the proposed regulation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge document. Actually, that can be obfuscating the key results. And in some countries, as you see in the concept note, governments use a 1-page summary note for the political actors that have to use impact assessment. What can impact assessment do in terms of policy coherence? It is, I would say, it is something you use to not to get the perfect policy choice, but to avoid radically wrong choices. So the goodness of impact assessment is proved by all the bad policies that were not considered because of the evidence pushing against that choice. But it also builds capacity in government. In many countries, regulatory impact assessment has led to interdepartmental exchanges, to new relationships with statistical offices, and to also get the stakeholders, the big federations of business, foreign direct investors, to provide data. So it's a continuous process of building capacity for appraisal in government. And as such, it also gives predictability to the regulatory environment. Predictability not in the sense of keeping legislation always the same, but predictability in the sense of having a predictable procedure or process in which policy formulation takes place. And finally, regulatory impact assessment mitigates biases and mitigates the rush to think in terms of analogy of a sample of one, of what happened yesterday. So it's a kind of a cooling our mind when that's needed, instead of acting on the basis of emotional responses, for example, to an accident or a single episode. How to implement impact assessment? The experience reviewed in the concept note is points to editing and customization. Obviously, each country has to take this single template that allows for many types of analysis and work on the basis of the political administrative process, which includes also the decision-making process in government. Secondly, you should work with incentives. What does the business community get from good impact assessment? What do public managers that engage with impact assessment get from it? That means for the business community, it creates expectations of stability, predictability, a platform for communication. So they should be the ones demanding high quality impact assessment and creating momentum for good impact assessment. For parliaments, impact assessment of new legislation provides additional information on the early stages of policy formulation. It increases transparency, and it's one of the ways in which parliaments can keep the government can hold the government to account. How to implement it is also obviously about targeting impact assessment and timing. There is no success if it is delivered very quickly as an encompassing panacea. Actually, that can create the wrong expectations. Talking about expectations in several countries, the experience shows that it's useful to implement impact assessment by building communities of learning, which means creating a process of interest, training within government of officers that talk about their own learning across the years, when typically the consultants leave the place and it's up to the government to embed impact assessment. A few words on what needs to be done. I think that the biggest result of this concept note, we have to connect regulatory impact assessments to a major factor of attractivity, a vision, a big target. And this is definitely the Sustainable Development Goals. They are the drivers. They make sense to impact assessment. Impact assessment acquires new meanings when it's done in the context of delivering on impact assessment and delivering, on the Sustainable Development Goals. But that means running impact assessment with a range of analysis that matter the most for Sustainable Development Goals. That means sustainability appraisal, gender appraisal, social inclusion, poverty, red tape for citizens. Those should be priority analysis if an impact assessment is used to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Thirdly, a last point, impact assessment needs more peer-to-peer learning and multilateral support. So the final part of the concept note talks about where you can get this additional support and where you can learn about the experience of others and customize it. Muchas gracias and thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Muchas gracias, doctor Radaeli, por su intervención. Y yo ahora voy a dar la palabra a la doctora Dorothy Lux. Ella es la directora ejecutiva.
Thank you very much, and I hope you...
Global on Monitoring and Evaluation System. Dr. Lux, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important event. As the last speaker in this series, I'm going to talk about monitoring and evaluation systems All the way through the previous presentations, we have talked about data and the importance of the evidence base for policy making. And to do that, we need sound monitoring and evaluation systems. What is the current status of these at the moment based on the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation in 2018? They did an assessment of the quality of national development strategies that are currently in place. And it was found that 64% of countries had good national development strategies, showing capacity in being able to develop these. But when they looked at the capacity of M&E systems to track the progress of those strategies, it was only 35%, a big gap in actually being able to trace whether the plans and strategies that were being made are actually effective or not. A year later, there was a review to see whether the SDGs were mentioned in the national strategies produced after 2015, and that reached 91%. So this means that if we're truly serious about moving and accelerating on the SDGs, how do we track the progress if we don't have good systems that will monitor the progress and evaluate the performance? There are increasing good examples. For instance, in Nepal, they revised their constitution and aligned this to the SDGs and explicitly mentioned the need to strengthen monitoring and evaluation. And in Finland, they have brought in a requirement for every 4 years to have an SDG related national evaluation just prior to the change in government, so that there is continuity in approach from one government to the other in terms of the SDG process. And we know that Colombia also has very good examples in terms of strengthening its M&E processes. And we heard a little about that earlier, which was great. So if we look at a national system for monitoring and evaluation, they are very closely linked. They are embedded in each other. There were questions earlier on about disaggregated data, but we need a monitoring system that actually generates raw data and aggregates that. And if we do that in the correct way, then the disaggregated data is available and can be traced and fed into our data systems, so that when you come to policy making, the data is there available, and it can be available in disaggregated form as well. At the moment for the SDGs, we know the voluntary national reviews are a way of collecting and processing the data into reporting on the SDGs, and that those provide a mechanism to improve and innovate and increase impact, as we've just heard Dr. Rodelli talk about, on impact and inclusiveness. But actually, a good M&E system is much more dynamic and can feed into strategy and policy at any time when there are policy issues, when there's a need to refresh and update policies. As we've seen with COVID-19, there's been a move to shift policy and strategy very quickly. Monitoring and evaluation becomes very important here. So are we talking about traditional monitoring and evaluation? No, we're not, because previously data collection relied mainly on national statistics. But there's been a shift to results-based management that links data to national planning and budgeting and performance management. And even more recently, and we've heard this alluded to as well, there's power in the learning that is generated through monitoring and evaluation for evidence-based policy making. This requires the M&E systems to be linked directly into policy making. And then there's the complexity aspects as well that can be brought into play. There are 7 building blocks that we can look at for M&E systems. And these are based on engagement of stakeholders throughout the whole process, ensuring that monitoring and evaluation is participatory. Measurability, defining what needs to be measured, not just collecting data for the sake of it, with clear indicators and targets. We tend to think of evaluation at the end of a policy cycle or project or intervention, but actually focusing more on evaluability at the beginning of a cycle means that plans for evaluation can be made, and commissioning of evaluations that are targeted to a policy requirement is much more effective. Improving the quality of data, ensuring that data is consistent, it's credible, it comes from different sources, and that allows us to bring in new technical tools that with big data, actually bringing data in which can be both aggregated and disaggregated using digital tools. Specifying the information needed for decision-making is powerful in evaluation, because evaluations can be very specific, they can be short, they can be longer. It includes impact assessments, but also there can be very targeted evaluation as well. This brings forward evidence which is of far greater worth and value for policy action, and then communication of those results back to stakeholders means that policies can be moved through more quickly and more effectively. So what are the actions which are most important to strengthen M&E systems for policy making? Firstly, to assess how effective the national systems are at present for policy making. Are they set up for learning as well as M&E? And are they being used for good adaptive management? Where is the capacity for M&E at the moment? Is it adequately deployed, or is it based only in one ministry or only in the university sector? How does that get embedded across the national systems so that M&E systems link in across different sectors? And what opportunities are there to strengthen the capacity? There's lots of new opportunities in monitoring and evaluation and learning, updating technology for data systems, remote sensing, digital mapping, different forms of communication, including mobile technology, social media, etc. But most probably important is proactivity in communication with stakeholders. Now we have multiple communication channels, we have critical timelines that can be kept to, and we can include the voice of those left behind, ensuring feedback loops that test the adaptive management actions more frequently in a more dynamic way to make faster and more effective change. Thank you. Back to you, Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lux. We have went to 4 of the 8 strategy notes. So we had one in coherent policy making, strategy, foresight, regulatory impact analysis, and the last one, monitoring and evaluation. Now I'm going to give the floor to Ms. Cecilia Cayo. She's from the Economic and Social, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs in the United Nations, and from the Financing for Sustainable Development. She's going to give a very brief remarks between sound policy making and integrated national financing framework. So Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm assuming you can hear me. So I'll be very brief, especially since ASG Harris also mentioned this link to integrated national financing frameworks in his opening remarks. So INFFs really are an approach to increase coherence of financing at the country level, and they aim to strengthen the link between policy, planning, and financing processes. So a country's sustainable development strategy lays out what needs to be financed, and INFFs would spell out how the national strategy would be financed. The concept originated in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, which the Financing for Sustainable Development Office at UNDESA coordinates, has been mandated to develop methodologies and guidance to support countries in developing and implementing INFFs. And these cover 4 building blocks: assessments and diagnostics to help identify financing needs, challenges, and opportunities, looking across all sources of finance; an integrated financing strategy, which is really at the heart of INFFs; monitoring and review systems; and fourthly, the underlying governance arrangements. And much of what is required for successful INFFs across the 4 building blocks mirrors the strategies being discussed today. So for example, many of the actions outlined by Dr. Nilsson to move up the coherence scale can help governments better work across sectors and manage trade-offs in the area of financing, ensuring policies respond to changing needs and circumstances, encouraging consideration of synergies and cascading effects when estimating financing needs and looking at potential financing policy solutions. INFFs also aim to mainstream a risk-informed and long-term approach to policymaking, looking across the full range of risks that a country may be facing and how these may impact its ability to finance sustainable development over time. So much of what is covered in the risk management strategy note, for example, but also what Ms. Tully presented around strategic foresight is very relevant. And the last thing I'll say is that, as hinted by ASG Harris, there are currently around 60 countries who have started to think about INFFs concretely and are working to develop and implement the concept. So this really represents a potential entry point for the application of the strategies presented today. So I'll leave it there. If there are questions, I can answer in the chat link.
Muchísimas gracias, Cecilia, por tu intervención. Y bueno, yo quiero agradecer a todos los panelistas porque han respetado el tiempo y tenemos unos 5 u 8 minutos para algunas de las múltiples preguntas que tenemos. Tengo una pregunta que es para Mr. Nielsen y la pregunta es: please to share some concrete examples of successful policy coherence in our region. Nilsson, Mr. Nilsson?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm just unmuting here. So I wrote that there is a case study in the note describing developments in Colombia, and of course, we have representation from DNP here that can be filling in, but I can mention a few things that they did practically. Is that they already in 2015, they established the high-level interinstitutional commission for an effective implementation of the post-2015 development agenda and the SDGs. And so they established this quite significant political commitment for coherence at the national level. And you had ministerial level representation, and it was guided by the Office of the President. And then they have a pretty detailed monitoring and evaluation system for the achievement of the SDG targets, which is explicitly facilitating coordination across development sectors. And this was mentioned by Mr. Gaviria before. And you have also representatives from civil society in the technical secretariat, multi-level consultations with which the DNP is coordinating. And finally, I would say they have also established budget aspect of the SDGs, which is that they connect the SDGs to the national budget. They have encoded the budget with tags for cross-sectoral, sub-sectoral topics. So these are a couple of examples, but I won't take more time now, but please have a look. It's like a one page roughly in the strategy note that you can consult. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nilsson. I have a couple of questions and I want to put over the panel because I don't have who can answer that. Una de las preguntas es si los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible deberían cambiarse debido a la pandemia. Si se deben cambiar algunos de los de las metas debido a la pandemia. Esa es una pregunta. Y la otra pregunta que lo dejo para el panel, a ver quién se anima a responderla, tiene que ver con cómo se han involucrado las universidades, las academias, para incidir, para apoyar a los decisores de política y si tienen algún ejemplo concreto que puedan compartir. Por ahora dejo esas dos preguntas. No sé si alguien se pone de voluntario para responderla.
Sure, I can have a first go around the SDGs changing. I would definitely say no. It was a bit of a miracle that the world agreed on 17 SDGs back in 2015. I don't think it could happen again at this day and age, that the world would agree again. In the spirit is not there like it was in 2015, and I think we should be happy with them as they are. Obviously, it's important to do a pandemic check on the SDGs and how it's affecting and how it's being affected. That is my realistic view on that point. I would say in terms of the second question, each of the strategy notes, I think, are surrounded by a quite vibrant academic community in policy sciences, broadly speaking. Kat represents the foresight, strategic foresight community, for example, and there are quite big literatures around all these topics that are contributing to varying degrees to national government decision making. And I think governments are differentially interested in consulting with academia on these topics, but people like us represented here are at least, we're trying to some degree be a bridge between the domains. I'll leave it there. Maybe Kat wants to add something.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Kat.
Oh, thank you. So two quick thoughts. When in foresight, it's often about a mindset change, and what you tend to do is you go into 2030 and you look back instead of being in 2020 and looking forward. And the short answer for why we shouldn't change the SDGs out to 2030 is because I imagine in 2030, when we look back at the past decade, there will have been many, many disruptions like the pandemic, but of different types, that this will have to support. And if we see the SDGs as a compass and not as a map, I think, which is what strategic foresight tells us, how to use it as a navigation compass when the terrain changes, then it's very helpful. In terms of academics, so academics are both wonderful and also have a very strong view of what has happened in the past, which is not always helpful when you think about foresight, because otherwise we would have, Bill Gates himself said that there was only a market for 2 or 3 machines, computers in the world. So it's important to bring youth as well as academics together. I think that is a very fertile collaboration. And I also think it's very important for it to be multidisciplinary. So the question is, for example, in futures work, how can you bring academics and experts about how the environment and climate change will affect, let's say, Peru and the agriculture, and also then talk about how experts who think about how moving away from an energy economy will affect government. You bring those 2 people together, and then you have a really interesting conversation about how will political and economic consequences play out over the next 10 to 20 years. So it's about the multidisciplinary approach, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Y ahora, ya para finalizar estos 2 interesantes paneles que hemos ido desde la perspectiva regional, ¿verdad? Y luego pasamos al tema más técnico de analizar un poco 4 de las 8 estrategias que se han preparado. Ahora yo voy a dar la palabra a Patrick Speeding, que es el secretario del Comité para la Administración Pública, quien nos va a hacer un breve cierre de la actividad y nos va a indicar los pasos a seguir. Así que Patrick, por favor.
Thank you very much, Moni. Yes, my comments will be very brief now that we're approaching the end of this workshop. As was mentioned earlier, there were some 200 or more individuals who registered for this event, and I see that there were approximately 120 or 130 participants with us today. So the appetite for this kind of work is clearly strong, and we are happy that it can be of use across Latin America and other regions. So we had a workshop on Tuesday in Africa, for example, that was also quite well attended. So we hope that this has been engaging and relevant. The notes are, as we said, are online. I see that there were a couple of, the links were resent a couple of times. For anyone who's having technical difficulties, of course, we'd be happy to assist and to send the notes to you or make sure that you get them or put you in touch with the speakers today. I would like to conclude by saying that our mandate in UNDESA, in the Secretariat of the Committee, from the Economic and Social Council is to work together with other partners, with international and regional organizations and all relevant stakeholders. So that's what we're trying to do here. That's what we're trying to do with the experts and with the committee members and with UNDP and the DCO and the country teams. So if you have an interest in collaborating with us, then please do let us know. One way to do that is through the feedback form. I think that there's a link to that feedback form that's in the chat, and we can send it to you as well separately. So please let us know and indeed provide feedback on this workshop and ways forward, what we can do better, but also how we can work together on these issues. Let me finally conclude by thanking Moni Pisani for her excellent work and for the excellent interaction that we have with her, for promoting the work of CEPA in Latin America, as was indicated earlier. Moni is a driving force behind this work of CEPA in Latin America, and we're tremendously grateful to her. We're very grateful to all the experts who have contributed. It's really invaluable to have them. We could not do this on our own, of course. So thank you again and again to all of those individuals who have so graciously contributed. I'd like to thank, sounding like the Academy Awards a little bit, but Mr. Harris, our ASG, for supporting this work and for making the connections between the work of CEPA and the principles of effective governance and this important area of, that is developing in political economy analysis and integrated national financing frameworks. So on that note, thank you again and see you soon, I hope. Back to you, Moni.
Thank you so much for your participation. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos por el interés y bueno, esperamos continuar brindando espacios como este. Muchísimas gracias y hasta luego.